Isaac and Jessica were born prematurely and spent the early weeks of their lives in neonatal care. So for me, this is far more than a mere professional and legislative interest. It's something that is deeply personal to me, and I feel very privileged to be an MP to advocate for the parents of other premature and sick babies. Now, in the early hours of the 26th of June 2015, my son Isaac was born prematurely at the Southern General Hospital in Glasgow. And during an aborted labour that would evolve into an emergency caesarean section, Isaac's heart rate plummeted. His blood sugars were incredibly low and he could not breathe without assistance. And within a few moments of being born, he was whisked away from his mum and I and transferred to the neonatal intensive care unit, where he spent the earliest part of his life in an incubator, hooked up to countless machines and wires. And in that unit, over a period, Isaac received amazing care, love and support from our NHS, which helped to stabilise his breathing, allowed his heart rate to recover and built up his blood sugars. But it would be days before we could even hold him. And as parents, our only contact with him was holding his tiny hands through the holes of an incubator. And in September 2018, we went through all of that again for the birth of Jessica. I'm afraid that Jessica's stay in hospital was even longer due to protracted breathing difficulties that culminated in her spending the first year of her life on oxygen. And I still vividly remember her turning blue and having to be resuscitated by the nurses in the neonatal intensive care unit. And I say all of this because you know, many of you, that sadly this is the norm, indeed the reality for those of us who are parents of premature and sick babies across these islands. And each year we know that 100,000 babies are born premature or sick and have an extended stay in neonatal care. And that stress, that uncertainty, indeed that vulnerability, it shows that the current legislation around leave and pay is simply not fit for purpose. UK employment legislation simply takes no account of the fact that some babies will spend much longer in hospital after being born, especially if they're born premature or sick. And as a result, parents like us require extra paid parental leave beyond that covered under the current arrangements. And in both cases, my statutory paternity leave had run out by the time Isaac and Jessica were even discharged from the neonatal unit. And sadly, that is the case for so many parents who face the brutal decision to return to work while their child is still in hospital, and in many cases still fighting for their lives. And I think that the government know that there are a number of major challenges for us. And in my short time as an MP, we've managed to, I think, significantly move the dial on this to the extent that there is now very clear cross-party support to legislate for enabling neonatal leave and pay. But one of the biggest problems that so many families face is an employer-employee lottery, and that is a lottery that so many of us just cannot afford to play. A number of employers in the public and private sectors have gone far and beyond to ensure that employees can be with their family on the neonatal unit and still receive pay. There are really good examples of that, whether it's Waltham Forest Council in the public sector, Sony Music in the private sector. Now that's great if somebody works for Waltham Forest or Sony Music, but as we all know, many of us do not work for them. And that's why I want to ensure that families don't face that employment rights lottery when heading into the neonatal unit. And across the world, other countries have already taken action to provide better rights and support for the parents of premature and sick babies. In Sweden, maternity leave commences at the point of discharge. In Ireland, maternity leave and pay are extended by the amount of time between birth and the original expected birth date. But here in the UK, I'm afraid that we are seriously lagging behind, and we are desperately failing parents when they need us most. Now, the government committed quite some time ago now to legislate for neonatal leave and pay. It did so in a Queen's speech, and I welcomed that, and I've always sought to ensure that this issue is above party politics. Look, I'm a nationalist MP from Scotland, and I'm not somebody who generally gets on particularly well with the UK government, but in an issue like this, it's so important that we put party politics aside and do the best. However, it saddens me that we are today marking yet another World Prematurity Day with no new legislation in the statute books. And this government talks a really good game about levelling up, but for parents of premature and sick babies, we haven't seen levelling up and that is a point that I'll be raising with the Prime Minister in the chamber at Prime Minister's Questions in just over 2 hours' time when I'm on the order paper. But I want to finally speak about some of the wider themes today, namely the mental health aspect and support for parents. I think that the new research that's been launched today is hugely powerful, though sadly, I think it is not surprising to those of us who have walked this incredibly painful journey before. I mentioned earlier on about when my son Isaac was born premature and admitted to neonatal intensive care. At that time, back in 2015, there was no emotional or psychological support available to parents. And I remember that when Jessica was born, just a few years later, we were offered all sorts of counselling and psychological support. But it is clear that, as is the case with so many aspects of this policy area, there is such a lottery depending on where you are, what your health trust is. And I don't think that is a lottery that we should be expected or indeed have to play. I think the report, the research that's being launched today acknowledges the impact on anxiety and PTSD, not to mention the financial impact. We're incredibly lucky in Scotland, for example, that we have the neonatal expenses fund, but that is not something that is unfortunately available in all parts of the UK. But we know that these mental health impacts, the PTSD, the anxiety, the financial impact, these all have incredibly long-lasting consequences for parents, which I believe very much flies in the face of the preventative spending agenda that we as politicians so often like to talk about. So I think we can, and indeed we must, do better. But I want to wrap up by thanking the smallest things and all of you who are on this call for absolutely everything that you do. And I want to remind you that here in Parliament, you have a number of allies, particularly MPs. There is a significant number of MPs actually who have walked the same path as you. And the APPG, which I'm incredibly privileged to chair, has a number of really strong advocates on a cross-party basis, most notably joined recently by Luke Hall, the MP for Thornbury and Yate, who has been through this fairly recently. He just left government and is in the process of joining the APPG. So there are lots of us here in Westminster who have put party politics aside to work on this issue, and the support that you offer us it really helps us in doing that. And I've got to say that this research, this report today, is a massive new tool in our armoury that we can take to government. But above all else, I hope that by all means we can mark World Prematurity Day next year. But let's make sure that when we do it, that we made massive strides forward, both in terms of neonatal leave and pay, but particularly on some of the experiences after NICU. And I think this report today is a massive step forward in doing that. So thank you very much, Catriona, and thank you, colleagues. And I look forward to spending a bit of time with you this morning.
Thank you very much, David, for sharing your experiences, and thank you for all that you do in Parliament, along with your colleagues, to champion the needs of families. Since my own experience of going through neonatal intensive care 10 years ago, which was hardly ever spoken about in Parliament, you didn't hear that. That just it is becoming a real issue that more people are aware of, and you've been a real champion for us as parents and for us as a charity. So we really thank you, and thank you for your time this morning as well. David's mentioned the report that's been launched today. That report is now live on our website, so please do have a look at that. And I'm really pleased to be able to present some of the findings from that report to you now. Wait, bear with me just 1 minute. You would have thought we'd got used to sharing screens by now. Here we go.
It's only been 18 months.
Only been 18. Is it really been 18 months?
18 years.
Here we go.
I can see your screen.
There we go. I'm hoping everybody can see that. Okay. And let me just put, perfect. Thank you. Right, today we're launching our Life After Neonatal Intensive Care. It's a post-pandemic survey, but it follows on from a previous survey that we did back in 2017, and it was really to find out what had changed for families in that time, but with a particular focus. Of course, it's been a very different 18 months in this time. We've had over 500 parents respond to the survey, 29 of which had had a premature baby during the course of the pandemic. So we took that from March 2020 to May 2021. And the majority, 71% of those surveys had had a premature baby in the years before, following our previous After NICU report, which was released in March 2017. The report explored what we know as a journey that lasts long after neonatal intensive care, and David's already touched on some of those themes. We explored parental mental health, the impact on family life, ongoing medical needs of babies after they come home from hospital, special educational needs for children born prematurely, and of course the impact of COVID-19. Every year, 60,000 babies are born in the UK prematurely. 84% of parents who responded to our survey felt that much more awareness was needed of the impact and lasting needs. This is something that we know from what parents tell us every day, and something that we will continue to work towards supporting them with. At the very heart of our report, we've put the parent voice there. When parents tell us that there needs to be more awareness, we don't need myself to be sharing my experiences anymore. We need awareness of what parents are experiencing right now. So we have throughout our report that parent voice. And I've just picked out a couple of quotes that really spoke to me. One parent said that when they reflected back on their neonatal journey, they get emotional thinking about it, and they worry about their baby's development, both physically and emotionally. They worry about how being premature might affect her when she starts school and later in life. And that nagging feeling that I know parents do experience, have they done enough to ensure that she's had the best start in life? And I think we all here together do want to ensure that babies born prematurely in the UK do have the very best start to life. Another spoke about that adrenaline when you're in the neonatal unit. You're on tenterhooks, you go through the motions. And they talk about it being hit by a bus once they returned home, the anxiety, postnatal depression, PTSD. They felt there was a lack of understanding even from some relatives was a big factor in that. And the reality of what they had been through and what their baby had been through only hit them once they'd left the unit. And that's something that we hear time and time again in this lasting journey. Overarching theme of the findings was that there needs to be more awareness, more understanding and more change. So I say 84% felt that there needed much more awareness of the longer term needs that children born prematurely needed. And less than a quarter felt that even their family or friends understood their journey through neonatal care. So if we think, if even those closest to those who are experiencing this don't understand what they've been through, then how can we expect the wider public or even professionals to understand? 29% felt that their health visitor understood their or their baby's needs, and just 18% agreed with the statement that their GP understood their or their baby's needs. It shows us that there's a lot of work still to do We focused on parental mental health. For those who responded, an enormous 77% experienced anxiety following neonatal intensive care, and that's in keeping with previous research that we've done. And as David said, as parents of premature babies, it's not particularly surprising. One statistic that did come out that surprised and shocked us was that nearly a quarter of parents have now been diagnosed with PTSD after leaving the neonatal intensive care unit. Now that's compared to 10% of parents being formally diagnosed back in our last survey in 2017. Now we consider there's a number of reasons for this. We hope that professionals who meet families after they leave the neonatal intensive care unit have more awareness and understanding. But we also suspect that parents also feel more empowered to talk about their emotions and their experiences because many more people are doing so, as well as the wider mental health campaigns that have been occurring over the last few years. And we could think it can only be a good thing, but we want to ensure that those who are being diagnosed with mental health difficulties after leaving the neonatal intensive care unit get the support that they need. 70% of parents are feeling guilty following premature birth. And over the pandemic, half of parents, or nearly half of parents, reported feeling isolated. And we know that the mental health needs of families when they leave the unit are often complex, and they have a whole host and variety of emotions when they come home. Having a baby in neonatal intensive care and when you bring them home can really impact on family life, which has a knock-on impact on other areas, for example, mental health. But over half of parents struggle to keep up with their social friendships following neonatal care. As I mentioned earlier, 21% didn't feel, only 21% felt that family and friends really understood the journey that they've been on. And nearly half of parents reported that having a baby born prematurely affected their financial circumstances. And we think this goes back to the importance of providing neonatal leave and pay for families so that they have that support at the time where they need it most. We know that children born prematurely, many of them have ongoing medical needs. Parents often tell us that when they leave the hospital, however, they're not aware that the baby is likely to have ongoing needs or that they're likely to be readmitted back to hospital. Nearly half of parents reported ongoing medical needs, and over half of parents told us that their children were readmitted back to hospital after leaving the intensive care unit. And this goes into a cycle, ongoing trauma. When you bring your baby home from hospital, I think most parents feel that that period is over. But then parents report flashbacks to hospital, increased anxiety, diagnosis of PTSD. And if we consider when you're being put back into an environment that you've experienced the trauma in the first place, it's not surprising that parents are reporting these ongoing difficulties. Moving on a little bit, we've been focusing in recent years more on the educational needs of children born prematurely as a charity, after parents told us in a small survey we did back in 2020 that they didn't feel that they or the school staff had a good awareness of the learning needs of children born prematurely. In our most recent survey, nearly a third of parents didn't feel that they had a good understanding of the developmental or learning needs that a child born prematurely may have. And 43% of parents with children who attended a childcare or nursery setting felt that the staff there didn't understand the learning or development needs of children born early. This was one quote that shone out to me. A parent said that their 27-weeker, who is now 3 years old, they felt that nobody gets the ongoing health issues that ex-premature babies have. She said that her premature baby's age was adjusted to corrected age when she turned 2, but she knew that her baby wasn't on par physically or mentally to a child who had been born at term. And she told us that she was so nervous about sending her daughter to play school in September. We know from the responses that many parents weren't able to send their children born prematurely into a childcare setting because childcare settings were closed in the early stages of the pandemic. And lots of parents are now worried about the impact that that will also have on the long-term outcomes. In response to parents' feedback, we launched our PremAware Award back in 2020, which Matt Wilkinson, one of our trustees, will be speaking about later today. If you're not able to stay for the whole day and the duration, please do have a look on our website to find out a little bit more about the award. The award supports the free online training for teachers, supporting them to better understand, or better identify and better understand and better support the needs of children in school born prematurely. So the big question from this report has been, what has been the impact of the pandemic? And in fact, some surprising statistics came out of this. I think when we put out the survey, we were anticipating a higher level of anxiety, a higher level of mental health needs in the parents who have parented during the pandemic. That wasn't the case. But first, we'll just compare what's happened since our 2017 report to more recently, the period between 2017 and 2020. We can see that in that period, the levels of anxiety of parents who'd had babies prior to the pandemic has increased from 63 to 82%. Unsurprisingly, back in 2017, a third of parents were reporting feeling isolated. However, in children who've been born pre-pandemic, and of course the survey was launched during the pandemic, half of mothers were reporting feeling isolated during that time. I'm sure lockdown has played a part in that. In terms of flashbacks, that jumped from 44% to 63%, and feelings of guilt again jumped from 61 to 76%. Back in 2017, just over a quarter felt that the health visitor understood their or their baby's needs. Now that has improved to 29%, and we don't think that is good enough, and we know that more work needs to be done in that area. As mentioned, we were expecting those parents who've had a baby in neonatal intensive care during the pandemic to be reporting higher levels of anxiety, higher levels of isolation. But that isn't what the report found. So if we look at those parents who'd had a baby prior to the pandemic, we go from 82% experiencing anxiety down to 63% during the pandemic. Again, those prior to the pandemic, half felt isolated and 39% felt isolated during the pandemic. Again, flashbacks occurred more in those prior to the pandemic, and feelings of guilt as well were a lot more significant in the cohort before the pandemic began. Now, we were quite puzzled at first by these statistics. It didn't go with what we were expecting at all, and I'm sure many people listening wouldn't have expected that. And there's a couple of theories on that. It has to be said that those who responded to the report during the pandemic, there were fewer parents who responded, but also those parents who'd responded, who'd had babies during the pandemic, were responding in the very early stages of either their baby still being in hospital or recently bringing their babies home. And I think that goes to what perhaps we really deep down know, that there is a lasting journey that parents go on. And it goes back to that quote of the mother who said that when she came home, she felt like she'd been hit by a bus, that she was beginning to process what had happened. And of course, when you add in children being readmitted to hospital, the worries then around your baby's development, financial worries, not being able to keep up with your social circles, feelings that your family don't understand what you've been through, you can begin to understand why the levels of mental health difficulties actually grow as time passes for families after neonatal intensive care. And that leads us on to the question around psychological support for families after bringing a premature baby home from hospital, and the importance of the timing of that. David already touched on the fact that being able to access psychological support after having a baby in neonatal intensive care can be a postcode lottery. And more often than not, being able to access psychological support is dependent very much on whether the unit you have been on offers that service. The statistics that we found show that actually parents are experiencing higher levels of mental health difficulties long after they come home from hospital. And we need to find a way to ensure that those parents, when they've been out of hospital for some months or even years, are able to access the support that they need. For the recommendations, we tried to keep these down to just a few. We now have 6. The first and the big one, we've already touched on this, that neonatal leave and pay was initially proposed to be implemented in 2023. Our concern is that that date might even be slipping, but we feel that very strongly that this date has to be brought forward to as soon as possible. We need to ensure that pathways are established between all hospitals and community services as a standard best practice. Many hospitals are already doing this, but it's not standard across the UK. We need to make sure that that support when families bring their babies home from hospital is in place. There needs to be more training around the specific needs of premature babies and their parents. And it needs to be easily accessible as well for GPs and health visitors. We would recommend that all health visiting teams and GP practices have a named and trained neonatal lead within their team. All NICU parents must have access to timely and tailored psychological support. We know that the mental health needs that families display are often complex following discharge from neonatal care, and that the support that should be available must reflect the complexity of their needs. The smallest things have a red book sticker scheme for parents to use so that they can have those on their red books. There's a visual reminder to community staff when they do leave the hospital, and we'd like those to be available for all parents in neonatal units across the UK. And finally, our PremAware Awards scheme. We need all teachers and schools to become PremAware so that they can support the learning needs of pupils born prematurely. We want to ensure the best possible outcomes for our children after premature birth. And our aim is that by 2030, all schools in the UK will be PremAware. In a nutshell, we know parenting during the pandemic has left a lasting impact, and there are lots of worries for the future. But parents who've experienced neonatal intensive care prior to the pandemic are also in need of additional support. We feel that in some respects the report has raised more questions than perhaps it's answered. So for us, we now need to think about where next. I said at the very start of this presentation that throughout the report, we have put the parent voice at the very beginning, at the very heart of the report. And I'm really glad to welcome Selma, who is a mum who experienced premature birth through the pandemic, who will be sharing her experiences with us today.
Thanks very much, Catriona. You can probably hear my little one in the back.
I can. Welcome, Selma.
Thank you very much for having me today and for organising this festival. It's really important, and it's really good to have this opportunity to talk about these things and to share our experiences. So I read this report as a parent that had experienced the NICU, and a lot of it resonated with me. Half of parents being readmitted into hospital, so 5 times, kept overnight twice. The mental health impact, the flashbacks, the fact that a lot of that happens to you after you leave the NICU, a lot of it resonated with me. I was reading the report where I felt that actually in some of my post-NICU experience that I was able to and also afford access to me in my time after. The thing that I'd really hope that they will stay with you is around those are the things that all parents that experience the neonatal unit really deserve to be able to their backgrounds, their socioeconomic backgrounds, everyone should be able to access those things. And I don't think that everyone does at the minute. Okay, so taking it back, let's go back to my experience in the NICU, because your post, in my opinion, how that experience unfolds, what it is like for you, what staff are like in the neonatal unit, can have a lasting impact as well. So my son was born, I've got two sons. My first was born at term, did not experience the NICU at home at all, was home like 2 days after he was born. My second son was due in June 2020. He was born in March 2020 on the cusp of a pandemic. He was born, and the next day the WHO declared the pandemic, and 2 weeks later the country was in a lockdown. And for us, in terms of our neonatal journey, everything changed. We went from being parents that could access the NICU, my time was limited to 2 hours a day. Dad allowed at all, and that remained the case. Sorry.
That's okay. Selma, your connection, I think, is jumping in and out just a little bit.
Okay.
So there's a few little, what sometimes I think are really important things for us to be able to hear are dropping out, but hopefully that might be a bit better.
Okay. News, and I'll see if I can jump onto another connection.
Okay.
So my access was limited to 2 hours a day. My husband was not allowed to access the NICU at all, and that weeks. We were there for 13 weeks. For 8 weeks, he wasn't allowed to see his baby at all, the son. That was even when my son hesitated twice. He went back walking alone in that circumstance. No husband with me. And that was a really painful and difficult experience. Baby in such a vulnerable state, and to not have like a love, the words to explain how difficult that was for me. We weren't allowed to be on the neonatal unit with another parent, so you had to book your time in. You weren't seeing any other parents. You weren't able to form the friendship. A lot of NICU parents, they helped them through their journey. And I wasn't able to 8 weeks of the time that I went. I didn't realize actually what I was missing out on until I spoke to a parent that had experienced the NICU and talked about how great neonatologists were. And that was sort of 8 weeks into my journey there. I have to say that at that 8 week point, the May point, things did start to change. I think come out of the shell, talk a little bit more. I've started to ask a bit more questions, access to the neonatologists who were actually kind and good and listened to me and gave me back this sense of lost by the lack of control over everything, of having a baby early, of really I lost my voice. And that, I always thought that if I for myself, but I couldn't in the neonatal unit, I really couldn't. So I think that around the time that he was born, March 2020, I think in February 2020, there was a study that came out of Israel, I believe it was, that talked about the long-lasting impact of it must have been a longitudinal study because it was talking about children 20 years on, and sort of better outcomes for children that had experienced skin to skin. Parent and not being able to see your child and knowing that it's not really within your control whether you're giving them skin to skin or not, it was really difficult. It was a really difficult time. It started to get better in May. That's 2 months into the journey when I started advocating more, started saying that these are the things that I need, was able to access the on-site psychological, the counsellor who I did ask to speak to, but nurses weren't sure if he was working during the pandemic, but he was. So I started to receive support, counselling support. I started to I felt like I was almost making the decisions around my son, like whether we should be planning to bring him home on oxygen or whether we should be trying to wean him off. I had one day in the NICU, which was Eid, which is a religious celebration where the NICU opened it up to my husband and my son. And so I got to have that moment with both of them together. I think it just gave me the kind of push that I needed to get through the last few weeks. And then he came home just after his due date. And the first few weeks, I didn't room in, I should add that as well. That was very different for my NICU experience. It was just that he was in the hospital and then he came home. So my first night with him, I was home with him alone. But to be honest, having not had access to him for so long, I didn't care that I wasn't rooming in. I was just happy that he was home with me. First few weeks were probably fine. June, he was readmitted twice into hospital because of breathing, how he was breathing, though it turned out to be fine on both occasions. I do think that was probably because I hadn't spent enough time with him to actually know what was normal for him and what was not normal for him. Nonetheless, that did happen. And then around about 6 weeks later, it started to hit me. And it initially hit me as anger rather than grief or sadness. It was anger at the neonatal unit. How could they've kept me away from him? How could they have kept my husband away from him? How couldn't they have done that? And I spoke to my health visitor about it. So that was one of the good things, was that the health visitor kept in touch. She came to weigh him. A lot of mothers weren't able to get their babies weighed at this time or have any kind of access to health visitors. I was able to do that. So she came to weigh him. She talked to me about IAPT. I referred myself, and I had some sessions in July, August, which were very much focused on how I felt about the neonatal unit, the anger that I had. That was like the easiest emotion for me to jump to, actually, in that circumstance, was anger. So we kind of talked through that anger, and there was a couple of things that I did in terms of, I always didn't want to raise it with a NICU because I felt like it was ungrateful because it saved my baby's life. But, you know, I did raise it. I did think, you know what, this was really hard. Maybe they should know this and try not to put anybody else through it. So I wrote to them, and it felt like a closure. They came back, they acknowledged that, you know, it wasn't perfect and that they would learn. And so I think that kind of put to bed the anger side of the NICU for me. As the summer went on and we got to sort of September, I still didn't feel better. When I was in the NICU, I was basically living day to day. And I remember when I was doing expressing the milk, and I would write the date, and it was a real moment when the date would change. So my midnight pump, I was so happy when March 2020 ended. Just felt like the longest month. And it was like I hadn't quite realized that that's how I was living my life, actually. Like, it was just about I wasn't enjoying my life. I was just trying to get through to the next day. That's the kind of mode that I was sort of stuck in. Nothing was bringing me joy. I didn't want to do anything. I didn't want to see anybody. And I didn't want to feel like that, because I felt like my children deserved the real me and not the me that they were getting. So I spoke to my doctor. He referred me to the perinatal mental health team. And to my surprise, I was diagnosed with PTSD. And to be fair, quite quickly, I was offered support via IAPT. It was trauma-based CBT, which was really helpful, and it did help me process a lot of the emotions. But also, I was able to access subsidized ongoing counselling, which was for a year. So it wasn't the 6 or the 12 that you get on IAPT. It was a year, because actually, as time went on, I am so profoundly changed by the NICU experience, who I am as a person. And that's a big thing. Motherhood in itself is a big thing, and that change in identity. If you are a parent that has experienced the NICU, had spent 95 days away from your child, had experienced this point where you were just like too scared to speak, and you can't understand why you were like that. Why was I acting like that? I mean, we've all heard of like fight or flight, but I'd never heard of freeze. I did not know that that's a reaction, and that's what was going on with me. so I think there was a lot of learning that I had to do about those 13 weeks, 14 weeks that we spent in the NICU. You know, my reactions, the things that I learned, the lessons that I learned. You know, the 6 and the 12 sessions were great, but actually the ongoing counselling, the week on week, was really helpful. And that was low cost because it was subsidised, but even with that, when you're on maternity leave, you're not earning money, not everyone is going to be able to pay that. So that's one of the key things, that kind of ongoing checking in as to how a mother's doing and giving them those opportunities to reflect on and to talk about how they're feeling in their kind of post-NICU experience, I think is really important. And it did start to help, and I did start to feel a little bit better, deal with some of the emotions that were coming out. It was still difficult because the wider general NICU community will say things that really do not make sense in the pandemic NICU experience. So when people talk about, like, these are our NICU buddies, you know, we don't have any because I wasn't allowed to be there at the same time as other parents. Or the guilt one is really interesting, and it came out in the survey as well. A lot of the mums that had their babies in the NICU before the pandemic talk so much about this guilt of, like, not being with them all the time. I mean, that's kind of removed for you if somebody is telling you that you can't be there with them. I didn't feel guilt because it wasn't my choice, basically. So I think you'll hear them talking about, you'll hear the community talking about things that just do not relate to you at all, and that made me feel quite isolated. That, you know, didn't really seem to be, even in all the kind of forums and things that are there to support mothers, which tends to come from other mothers and parents that have experienced the NICU. There wasn't really anyone that really had that experience, or anyone that would say, oh, I did it totally by myself as well. I know how hard that is. I know what that feels like. So it sort of continued to kind of remain an isolate, sort of a time where I felt really isolated. But I think having the help with my mental health really helped. And also I think that though there was some limits to how Isa, that's my son, was sort of being seen by healthcare professionals, he was being seen by them. Like, we were able to go and get him weighed. You know, when I was concerned about him reaching milestones, I contacted our PT who straight away saw him, basically. Having said that, again, going back to the affordability around things, when we were in that peak last winter, I paid for somebody to come and see him because I needed somebody who was a professional to see him and to say, yep, his development looks fine, and for it not to be on a Zoom link. But I know that most trusts have moved away from that now. And so, you know, he started to basically be able to access services a bit more. That helped. The professionals that we spoke to, actually, in the round, were not bad in terms of understanding that he's born early and his needs are different. They made referrals, even sort of what I would consider sort of throwaway comments. They would be like, should we get the speech and language therapist to sort of have a look at how he's drinking, if you're worried about that. And, you know, the speech and language therapist turned up and read all his file. You know, it was, you know, I'd not have to go through all that again and kind of re-traumatize myself. So those sorts of things, I think I was quite fortunate in some of the healthcare professionals that I was coming across. By no means was it perfect, but I think the fact that there was an understanding and sort of the time taken to understand Isa's birth and background and history, that really helped as well. But I think by far the thing that helped me the most was the decision to take unpaid parental leave initially, and then special leave. So I was probably due back April 2021. It actually was sort of prompted because childcare was just such an issue at that time. I think we were just coming out of the January lockdown. I wasn't able to secure childcare. I'd had a nursery that my eldest had gone to, and knowing all the kind of feelings that dropping my son off at nursery and having to walk away from him could bring back because of the neonatal experience, I was really keen that he went to that nursery. So that was proving a little bit tricky. And, you know, my husband just said, why don't you see if you can get some more time off? I had previously requested neonatal leave, but I was told that I wasn't able to have it. You know, it wasn't an easy decision, obviously, to lose out. I'd already taken the extended maternity leave, and in fact, I should say that the point at which I was diagnosed, the point at which it really hit me the most, is the point that most people's paid maternity leave runs out. So again, the fact that I was fortunate enough to be in a position that I knew I was still having 6 months off after that, you know, the additional maternity leave, I know not everybody takes that. So if you're a mother that doesn't take that, my experience is that that is the point that it really started to hit me. So I can't imagine what it would have been like had I gone back to work at that point. But I'd got to the 12 months and I took additional time off. It was agreed, unpaid. So I only went back to work now in September 2021. And those months that I had off with him were just brilliant. You know, he started to start to hit milestones. Like, if I had left him at the end of my maternity leave, I was worried about the fact that he wasn't sitting. There were so many things that he wasn't doing. I had to split my time with homeschooling my eldest and him, basically, during that sort of January to March lockdown, which was also really difficult because I felt like I wasn't giving him the time that he needed and the focus on his development. And around about his first birthday, I was really worried that he wasn't sitting independently, so on and so forth. But he sort of, as people do say with many premature babies, sort of like once he started, he just kept going. So by the time I left him, he was this baby that was a toddler that was walking around, that was kind of you know, making his views known, should I say. And it just felt easier to leave him. And in fact, when I took him to the nursery as that boy, the nursery basically said, I've never seen a baby settle this fast. And when I walked away happy. I walked away without any of the anxiety that I thought I might experience. And there was work that went into those 4 months. Like, I took him regularly to the children's centres, you know, help socialise him, you know, those sorts of things. And it kind of ended up making that experience of him joining nursery, that experience of me going back to work. I've also gone back to work part-time. Again, that comes down to being fortunate enough to be able to make that decision. But it helps because in my head, he's 20 months now, 17 months corrected. But in my head, you know, there are still things that I want to do with him in terms of supporting his development. And that gives me the time to do that. So I think the three key things really are access to mental health services, definitely medical professionals knowing and understanding the needs and taking the time to understand the needs of a premature baby, and the time, because it really does feel like an injustice at the time that is stolen from you, especially exacerbated by the fact that I wasn't even with him, you know, 22 hours of the day. I didn't see him during my maternity leave. I think the only reason I probably even coped in that time was because I had an eldest son that I was busy homeschooling him. So I was still getting to be a mother in that time. I can't quite imagine what it would be like if it was your only one and you're on maternity leave and you don't get to be a mum, even in the neonatal setting. So I think those are the three key things that really helped me. I'm not here standing in front of you saying, oh, and I'm totally cured and everything is fine. You know, there are still moments where flashbacks will happen, where emotions will creep up. It's just sort of having the tools to be able to manage and deal with that. And of course, you know, he's not too corrected yet. And I know it doesn't end at too corrected, but I think there's that in my mind as well. Like, I don't take for granted the fact that he's hitting milestones and things are going well for us, because he did have a difficult start to life. He was left in an incubator for 22 hours of a day. He didn't experience my touch. Like I said, all the studies are saying that was important to him. So I don't know what the long-term impact on him is, but I'm lucky as much of my time now to the effect of kind of sacrificing pay and like, you know, I'm not there. I'm working sort of a different pattern. But I mean, I know not everybody. That's the key message. You know, irrespective of your race, your where in the country you are, those things are so important. And it's not, and the one thing that I would say is it's really not good for employers of coming back the way that I was at that 6 month point. I probably would have gone off sick. and I wouldn't be making the kind of impact that I've been making now back at work. So things that I'd like to leave you with, and I hope that my connection was okay. Thank you.
It was, Salma. Salma, thank you so much for sharing your experiences and talking so movingly about them and so bravely. It's very hard for any parent to speak about their experiences through neonatal intensive care, let alone sort of to do it so soon and to do it so movingly and so bravely. So thank you very much. And it's lovely to see how well Ezra is and hear how well Ezra is doing now. So thank you. I just wanted to, Salma, pick up on a couple of things that you said before going to questions, because a couple of things really struck me. One was you talking about NICU buddies, and that you didn't get to have NICU buddies. And I think it's so important when we speak about the power of parents coming together to support each other. And we often talk about people can only really understand that neonatal journey if you've been through it. But if you've been through it during a pandemic, firstly, you've experienced it very differently from any other parent who's been there before. But as you say, you've done that on your own. And I think it's really important for professionals here today and for us as a charity to think about how we support those families who've been through it. You also spoke a lot about sort of accessing services and how lucky you were. And what strikes me, Selma, about you is you're a real advocate for your children. And I think our concern often is that parents are not always in the position to be able to be the best advocates that they can be for their children. So again, all of us here today really need to step up and be the advocates for children born prematurely as they journey on after their neonatal intensive care experience. Salma, I know we've got some questions coming in, so I am going to open it up a little bit to people. I think there was one comment though that did struck me, and I think it was Hayley who said it, that I think if I saw it correctly, it said something about somebody in the neonatal unit said that it'll hit you at some point, then offer any services after that. And Salma, I was hoping to ask you about how you feel parents, after your experience of being able to access services, how parents would cope without having access to those services.
Gosh, it's honestly something that I don't want to think about, because, you know, it didn't really feel like a life that I was living at that point. So I know that might sound really dramatic, but the fact is I was just going through the motions. I wasn't, you know, I just was not mentally present. It was like I wasn't there. It was like just vacant. And if I had not accessed the mental health support, that would have continued. And I can just imagine that would just get worse with time. You know, Isa has chronic lung disease, so you have to be really careful when he gets a cough or a cold. You can imagine right now he's getting quite a lot. You know, having the kind of tools to be able to cope with that and to be able to sort of not remove the emotion, but to manage the emotion is so important, because it's not, like I said, it's not something that's just over, it's ongoing. I'm being, you and other parents as well, be ongoing, will be put in situations that are not easy and that feel a lot worse because of the vulnerability that you've seen your baby go through and because of possible ongoing medical needs. So I can't quite imagine how parents that don't have those tools to be able to manage their emotions in those circumstances, or to have processed and dealt with the NICU, actually cope. I could imagine I would just be I wouldn't be speaking to you like this. I think I would be quite angry, and I was quite angry, angry at everybody, and it's just not a nice way to be, basically, when actually what it is that you're grieving, you're sad, and you need to process, and you're scared as well, and you need to process all those emotions. Because for me, I certainly was, they were just like paused while I was in the NICU. I couldn't do the NICU, I couldn't do the homeschooling, the NICU, the holding it together and experience that range of emotions. That's why it all came out afterwards, and I needed some help to kind of like, I think that the trauma-based CBT therapist said it was like your files are all over the place and you just kind of need to get them in order. They still exist, they're still there, but there's just like a bit more of an order for me, like a bit more of a process in dealing with those emotions. So yeah, it's not something that I really want to, I can't imagine it.
Absolutely. Thank you. If anybody else has got any questions, please do put them in the chat box, or you can raise your hand as well. That's working there for us.
Can I just say one more thing that I've just remembered? You know, healthcare professionals, especially those in neonatal care, like that are working in neonatal care, neonatologists, certainly for me, their opinion and what they say, it meant a lot, because they are professionals that see children that are born prematurely day in and day out. At Issa's 1 year development check, I sat down, and the first thing the neonatologist said to me, and I wasn't expecting it, was, "How are you?" And I was just like, "Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm okay. It has been a bit difficult." All this stuff started pouring out. And I said, "Oh, sometimes I keep thinking, is it because of this? Is it because I was exercising? Is it because of this?" And he just looked me straight in the eye and he said, "Firstly, if it was because of exercise, we would have known by now. We'd have a lot more premature births. And secondly, how do you know that it wasn't because you were looking after yourself that he stayed longer? How do you know that? You don't. Maybe that's why he's here." And that coming from him, someone who is, it just did, like, I feel like I could have lived all of my life. Those warm words, that reassurance that this was not your fault, it was like a liberation.
I think that's so important. And actually, Sarah has just asked a question around, was there anything that anybody said that helped you, that made it better? And it sounds like that, sort of knowing that actually there wasn't anything that you did. Was there anything else that that people said to you, either during your experience in the pandemic or once you were at home, things that helped support you?
I think that probably the key thing that I was battling with it, but probably didn't realize I was battling with it. Like I said, it was quite unexpected because I wasn't expecting him to ask me that question. So I think once I started what I was saying seriously, I would say, they would say, "Oh, we're just trying to wean him off oxygen," and I would say, "Just I'm home now." "Oh, okay, fine. We'll start preparing to send him home on oxygen, but we won't try and wean him off." No, I want you to do both. Try and wean him off, but also prepare to bring him home. Those sorts of. He eventually came home, didn't need it. But I think just sort of saying, "This is how I want it to go," and them saying, "Okay, you're the parent. You want to." Where you want to, and I think that sort of, like I was saying, that agency and that being involved, rather than what we've talked here about parents being able to advocate for themselves. Look, I certainly couldn't in the first 8 weeks. I could not say anything. Sometimes I just think that was so not me, but then experience to kind of have a baby in the neonatal. Why I have to always, we won't know the why, and then to go into a pandemic, have your child at home, and everything else that was happening, it was just so that wasn't for myself at all. And when I got there, and I started to, it wasn't like I was met with resistance. Started saying things, I think there was kindness and there was understanding. In fact, it was then the neonatologist that said, "Do you want to?" I said, "Yeah, I was asking about this, but I thought he wasn't working." And said, "No, he is." So, then I had that for like the last few weeks that I was there weekly. I was speaking to him. So I think just that, and also when I emailed them to say this is how it felt, that they responded sort of with kindness as well, and said, "We're going to take it on board, our communication," and things like that. I think all those things really helped.
Thank you, Salma. That's so helpful. And I think sharing your experiences today, looking at the chat, people have found it so valuable, and really humbling to listen to you to speak today. So thank you very much for joining us. And I do hope you're going to stay with us for the rest of the day as well. Let me take that off there. I'm just going to share my screen again. If any of you are on Twitter, I must say my phone keeps pinging. I have turned it over so it's not distracting me, but please do join the conversation over on Twitter with us. Let's hopefully, no, that's not working. Bear with me 1 second. And then we will be shortly going to a break. Here we go. Apologies.
Just while you're doing that, Catriona, I'm going to put the link to the full report into the chat so everybody can go to our website and see all of those stats that you were sharing earlier in the report.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Sarah. Is that coming up for people? It's not coming up. Oh, there we go. So coming up at 11:30, we have the Employer with Heart panel discussion, which Sarah will be leading. So do stay and join for that. But in the meantime, please do have a look over at our website, and again, have a look at the report and the full details of that. Do please share it far and wide with your networks. And the aim really is to firstly, as we mentioned, raise awareness. Then we want to increase understanding and make the changes that are so desperately needed at the moment to support families after neonatal intensive care, with a particular focus on supporting those families who parented during the pandemic. Coming up at 12:30, we've got the Prematurity Award update, and then a Dads Do NICU coffee and chat session, which if you weren't here at the very beginning of the session, isn't just for dads, it's for anybody who would like to join that session to better understand how we can support the needs of fathers in neonatal intensive care. And listening to Salma there, I think that's most pertinent at the moment when particularly fathers have had access restricted to being able to visit their babies whilst they've been in hospital. As mentioned, we're a really tiny charity and run currently entirely by volunteers. Lots of you donated when you signed up to the event, and thank you very much for that. You can still donate. You can follow the QR code there. Any money raised does help us continue the work that the charity is doing, and that will be that from me.